This is not entertainment. This is madness. This is everything wrong with what young people call music today. Ed Sullivan's voice was ice-cold with disgust as he stood in the wings of CBS Studio 50, watching the young man at the microphone through the monitor. It was September 1957, and 24-year-old Little Richard was rehearsing for his first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. And Ed Sullivan was watching his carefully controlled world spiral into chaos. Little Richard wasn't just singing. He was screaming, wailing, pounding the microphone stand, his pompadour hair flying wild, his whole body gyrating with an energy that seemed to come from another planet. This wasn't the polite entertainment Ed Sullivan had built his reputation on. This was something raw, dangerous, completely uncontrollable. Ed turned to his producers with an expression of pure horror. Get him under control. Now. What happened in the next 18 hours would create one of the most explosive moments in television history and reveal a secret about Little Richard that would change everything. Before we dive into this incredible story, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness is the moment when rock and roll's most flamboyant performer faced television's most conservative host. Neither one would back down. To understand why Ed Sullivan was so disturbed by Little Richard, you need to understand what Little Richard represented to 1950s America. Little Richard had grown up as Richard Wayne Penniman in Macon, Georgia, in crushing poverty. His family was deeply religious, Seventh-day Adventists, who believed that secular music was the devil's work. But Little Richard had been born with an extraordinary gift. He could sing like nobody else. Not smooth crooning, but wild, screaming, gospel-influenced rock that seemed to come from somewhere beyond human experience. As a teenager, Little Richard struggled with conflicts that went deeper than just music. The church said rock and roll was sinful. His family said his flamboyant behavior was shameful. But Little Richard couldn't stop being who he was. The music, the energy, the outrageous personality, it wasn't an act, it was who he was. By 1955, Little Richard was performing in small clubs across the South, building a reputation as the wildest performer anyone had ever seen. He didn't just sing songs, he attacked them, screaming Tutti Frutti and Long Tall Sally with intensity that left audiences stunned. Elvis Presley had shocked America with his hip movements, but Little Richard made Elvis look like a choir boy. When Art Rupa at Specialty Records heard Little Richard perform, he immediately recognized something revolutionary and terrifying. This kid is either going to change music forever or destroy himself trying, Rupa told his staff. There's no middle ground. In 1955, Little Richard recorded Tutti Frutti. The song was wild, sexual, incomprehensible to most adults. Radio stations were terrified to play it, but the few that did got an overwhelming response. Young people, especially young black people, went crazy for it. It was everything their parents feared, which made it irresistible. As the song started climbing the charts, Ed Sullivan's talent coordinators heard it. They knew Ed would despise it. But they also knew that after the massive success of booking Elvis and Jerry Lee Lewis, they needed to keep bringing in rock and roll acts to maintain their dominance with young viewers. They approached Ed about booking Little Richard. Ed's initial response was absolute horror. Have you seen this person perform? Ed asked his coordinators. He's vulgar beyond description. He's everything that's wrong with this rock and roll degeneracy. I will not have him on my show. But his coordinators pressed harder than usual. Mr. Sullivan, he's the biggest thing in black music right now. If we don't book him, Steve Allen will, and we'll lose not just the white youth audience but the entire black audience. Ed reluctantly agreed to watch footage of Little Richard performing. What he saw confirmed every nightmare. Little Richard was everything Ed Sullivan feared about rock and roll taken to its absolute extreme. But the audience response in the footage was undeniable. People were going completely insane for him. Ed made a decision that he would regret for the rest of his life. He would book Little Richard, but with the strictest conditions he'd ever imposed. The performance would be completely controlled, sanitized, civilized. Little Richard would stand still at the microphone like a proper singer. He would sing his song without screaming, without gyrating, without any of his outrageous stage antics. Ed's coordinators contacted Little Richard's manager and extended the invitation with unprecedented restrictions. Little Richard was ecstatic when he got the news. The Ed Sullivan Show was the biggest platform in America, the key to mainstream success. But when he heard about Ed's conditions, he laughed so hard he nearly fell over. They want me to stand still. They want me to sing pretty. That ain't Little Richard. That ain't what the people want to see. His manager was terrified. Richard, this is the Ed Sullivan Show. You cannot mess this up. Just do what they ask. One show their way. Then you can do whatever you want forever. But Little Richard wasn't convinced. What nobody knew at the time, what would remain Little Richard's deepest secret for decades, was that he was struggling with his sexual identity in an era when being different could destroy your life. His flamboyant performance style wasn't just musical rebellion. It was the only way he could express his true self in a world that demanded he hide it. The night before the show, Little Richard was in his hotel room, pacing frantically. He'd been thinking about Ed Sullivan's restrictions all day. What if I can't do it? Little Richard said to his reflection in the mirror. What if I get up there and I'm just another boring singer? What if I lose everything that makes me, me? Little Richard looked at himself and realized something profound. The reason he was getting this opportunity wasn't despite who he was. It was because of who he was. If he changed, if he played it safe, he wouldn't be Little Richard anymore. He'd just be another performer. The next day, September 15th, 1957, Little Richard arrived at CBS Studios for rehearsal. Ed Sullivan watched from the control room as Little Richard took his position at the microphone for the sound check. And that's when Little Richard did exactly what he always did. He exploded into Tutti Frutti, with such ferocity that the studio seemed to shake. He screamed,
Ed Sullivan
he danced, he threw his whole body into the performance like his life depended on it. The studio crew stopped working and stared. They'd never seen anything like it. Ed Sullivan came down from the control room, his face dark with rage. He walked onto the stage, and his presence immediately silenced everything. Stop. Ed commanded in a voice that could freeze fire. Little Richard stopped mid-scream. He turned to face Ed, knowing exactly what was coming. Young man, Ed began, his voice trembling with controlled fury. What exactly do you think you're doing? Little Richard met Ed's eyes with surprising calm. I'm singing my song, Mr. Sullivan. That, Ed said, is not singing. That is, I don't even know what that is. Tomorrow night, 80 million Americans will be watching this program. Families, children, people who trust me to bring decent entertainment in their homes. What you just did is not decent entertainment. It's a mockery of music itself. Little Richard felt something rise inside him. Not anger, but clarity. With all due respect, Mr. Sullivan, this is how I perform. This is what people want to see. This is who I am. I don't care who you think you are. Ed shot back. I care about what's appropriate for American television. Tomorrow night, you will stand at that microphone like a gentleman. You will sing your song properly, without screaming, without gyrating, without any of these displays. You will behave like a professional musician, or you will never work on television again. Do you understand me? The studio was completely silent. Everyone was watching this confrontation between old America and new America, between control and freedom. Little Richard was supposed to say, yes, sir, supposed to agree, supposed to submit. Instead, he said something that shocked everyone in the room. Mr. Sullivan, I appreciate this opportunity more than you know, but I can't promise I'll perform your way. This isn't just music to me. This is my soul. If I have to hide my soul to be on your show, then maybe your show isn't for me. Ed Sullivan's face turned purple. In 30 years of entertainment, no performer had ever challenged him so directly. You're making the biggest mistake of your life, young man, Ed said quietly. I'm offering you the chance to be seen by more people than you'll ever reach otherwise. And you're throwing it away because you can't control yourself for 3 minutes. It's not about control, Little Richard replied with surprising dignity. It's about truth. If I get up there tomorrow and pretend to be something I'm not, I'm lying to everyone, the audience, myself and God. And I won't do that. Ed stared at Little Richard for a long, tense moment. Then he turned to his producers. We'll see tomorrow night whether he can be professional. If he can't, we'll cut to commercial, and he'll never appear on this show again. That night, back at his hotel, Little Richard sat by the window, looking out at the New York City lights. For the first time in his life, he felt completely alone, but he also felt completely sure of who he was. September 16th, 1957. The Ed Sullivan Show went live at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Families across America settled in front of their television sets, expecting their usual Sunday night entertainment. Ed did his opening monologue, introduced the first guests. The evening was proceeding normally. Then it was time for Little Richard. Ed's introduction was notably cold. Our next performer is a young man who's had some success with his recording of Tutti Frutti. Little Richard. No enthusiasm, no build-up, just a name. Little Richard walked onto the stage, and America got its first look at him on live television. Young, impossibly energetic, wearing a suit that seemed barely able to contain his personality. He approached the microphone. The studio audience held its breath. Ed Sullivan watched from the wings. 80 million Americans waited, and Little Richard made his choice. He wasn't going to play it Ed's way. He was going to play it his way. He opened his mouth and Tutti Frutti erupted across American living rooms with such force that it seemed to crack the very air. Within seconds, Little Richard was moving, dancing, screaming, a wop bop a loo bop a lop bomb boom, with such joy and abandon that the studio audience forgot where they were and started screaming along. Parents watching at home were horrified. Teenagers were transfixed. This wasn't just a performance. This was a revolution happening in real time. In the control room, the director looked at Ed Sullivan, waiting for the signal to cut away. But Ed just stood there, paralyzed, watching his authority crumble on live television. He could stop this. He could end it with a single gesture. But something held him back. Maybe it was the audience reaction. Maybe it was the knowledge that stopping it would admit he'd lost control. Or maybe, deep down, even Ed Sullivan recognized that he was witnessing something that couldn't and shouldn't be stopped. Little Richard performed for 3 minutes and 20 seconds, every moment more explosive than the last. When he hit the final Tutti Frutti, the studio audience was on its feet, screaming with an enthusiasm Ed had never seen in his studio. Little Richard stood at the microphone, breathing hard, sweat streaming down his face. He looked directly at the camera, then at Ed Sullivan in the wings. The message was unmistakable. I did it my way and America loved it. Ed walked onto the stage as they went to commercial. His expression was unreadable. Little Richard expected to be banned, denounced, thrown off the show. Instead, Ed did something completely unexpected. That was energetic. Ed said stiffly. The audience certainly seems to appreciate it. Little Richard nodded, still catching his breath. Then Ed said something that surprised everyone. You're very talented, young man. But talent without discipline can be dangerous. I hope you remember that. Then Ed walked away, leaving Little Richard standing there, unsure whether he'd just been complimented or warned. The reaction to Little Richard's performance was immediate and explosive. The CBS switchboard was overwhelmed with calls. Half were outraged parents demanding that this degenerate never be allowed on television again. Half were young people begging to know when Little Richard would be back. Ed Sullivan's office received thousands of letters, some condemning him for promoting moral decay, others thanking him for bringing real music to television for the first time. Ed himself was deeply conflicted. He'd been defied on his own show, his authority publicly challenged. But the ratings for that episode were enormous, the highest of the entire season. In the weeks after the show, Ed made a surprising decision. He invited Little Richard back, not immediately, but for a future show. The reasoning was pragmatic. If Little Richard was going to be on television anyway, it should be on the Ed Sullivan Show. Little Richard appeared on Ed's show 2 more times in 1958. Each time Ed tried to impose restrictions. Each time, Little Richard ignored them completely. And each time, the ratings soared. Looking back at Ed Sullivan's relationship with Little Richard, we see a fascinating clash between 2 different worlds. Ed was right that Little Richard's performances were unlike anything television had ever seen. Wild, uncontrolled, potentially dangerous to the social order Ed was trying to preserve. But Ed was wrong to try to suppress what made Little Richard special. The energy, the flamboyance, the complete authenticity. These weren't flaws to be corrected. They were gifts to be celebrated. The tragedy is that both men were prisoners of their time. Ed felt he had to maintain control to protect society's values. Little Richard felt he had to choose between his authentic self and his soul's salvation. Little Richard, now in his 90s, has spoken about Ed Sullivan with surprising warmth. Mr. Sullivan was a gentleman. He didn't understand my music, but he gave me a chance when nobody else would. He opened the door to mainstream America for Little Richard. The story of Ed Sullivan and Little Richard is ultimately about the collision between tradition and revolution, between control and freedom, between the way things were and the way they were becoming. Ed could have kept his show safe and predictable. Instead, he chose to give a platform to something he didn't understand, something that challenged everything he believed. Little Richard could have played it safe, could have toned down his act. Instead, he chose to be authentically, explosively himself. The result was a moment of television that changed everything, not just for rock and roll, but for the very idea of what was possible on American television. If this story moved you, hit subscribe and share it with someone who appreciates the courage it takes to be yourself. Have you ever had to choose between being authentic and being accepted? Remember, sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to be anything less than who you really are, even when powerful people are telling you to change. Little Richard knew that, and because he did, music was never the same.